Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Austin Scott, and this is the freshman class. This is a picture of my son, Wells. In our class, we represent over 300 children and grandchildren, and from day one, we have said that we're here to protect them, that this generation is more important than the next election. On the day of our swearing in, America had been 678 days without a budget. Not only was this irresponsible, but it was outrageous, and the American people know that. In this past year, the President presented a budget, the House adopted a budget, and the Senate defeated both of those budgets. They then turned around and left town without producing an alternative budget. Senator Reid would like to say that freshman Republicans are responsible for the gridlock in Washington, but that's simply not true. We've passed a budget. We've passed 27 jobs bills. We stand willing to allow the process to work. Senator Reid has closed the door at every opportunity. Now, the future of America is bright, but without a budget, the state of our union is uncertain. This next week, the President, on what will mark the 1,000th day that this country has operated without a budget, will present the State of the Union. We're here simply to ask the President to challenge Harry Reid and the Senate to pass a budget. Pass a budget so that the job creators in America have some certainty and can go out there and do what Americans want to do, and that's get back to work. I'm going to turn it over to Rick Berg. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. You know, we came out here to change Washington, and the one thing that we see that's wrong is we have to get back to regular order. For over 200 years, America has faced wars, they faced depressions, they faced all kinds of challenges, but they did that using a regular order. And one of the biggest obvious things that we're missing right now is a budget. And so from our perspective here, we can't resolve the financial mess that our country's in unless the House, the Senate, and the President come together, work on these budgets, work on the numbers, and move them forward. We have to get certainty back into this country. If we have certainty, we'll see small business create jobs, we'll see people invest and grow our economy. So in order to give people that certainty, they need to trust and know that Congress is going to live by its own rules. It's going to make the difficult decisions that need to be made on their deadlines. This is one of the most important things that our class, that our Congress can do in the second half of the 112th Congress is get back to a regular order. With that, I would like to introduce another colleague, Rob Woodall from Georgia.
Rick, I appreciate that. I just want to talk about that. We know as a freshman class that it's easy to blame folks who believe in something when things don't happen as fast as America would like for them to. And I want to say to Harry Reid here this morning, you can do it. You can do it. It's been 1,000 days, but he can do it. I will tell you the proudest moment of my 1 year in Congress was the day we passed the House budget. Proudest moment of my tenure in Congress. Harry Reid, you can do it, and you can't do it all at one time. Even with this freshman class, we couldn't get the balanced budget in a year. We had to balance that budget over a series of years. You have to take it one step at a time, but it has to begin somewhere. 1,000 days next Tuesday since the Senate last took its first baby step towards these decisions. We're not just pointing the finger of blame here in the United States House, though. The budget we do have control over, the U.S. House of Representatives budget, we began to act 5% cut off members' budgets right off the bat. Thrift begins at home, and we're leading by example. 5% last year, another 6% this year. In my office, we took another 10% beyond the 5% and the 6% because thrift begins at home. It's the little things. You can't do it all at once, but you can't get to where you're going until you take the first step. 1,000 days since Harry Reid took that first step. America deserves better, and I know the United States Senate can do better. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague. I don't see Sandy here, so I'm going to introduce Blake Farenthold.
I'm behind you. All right, Brad. Thanks. How you doing? It's good to be here today. You know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We're trying to get this country's financial house in order, but we're doing it without the most basic tool of financial planning, and that is a budget. When the State of the Union comes around, 1,000 days. You can almost finish college in 1,000 days. Y'all ought to be able to come up with a budget. Harry Reid, let's do it. Let's do it for the American people. The American people want to know what their future holds. They want a better future, and that better future comes from financial responsibility, and it comes from creating an environment where businesses and individuals know what's going to happen so they can plan their budgets. Every business in this country works under a budget, but the government doesn't. We've got to fix that. And I call on the United States Senate and Harry Reid to make that happen. With that, Steve Stivers is next up. Steve.
Thanks, Blake. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. And, you know, every family in America has a budget. Every business in America has a budget. The United States of American government needs a budget. And it's been 1,000 days since the Senate passed a budget. I'd like to introduce everybody to my daughter, Sarah, who's 868 days old. In fact, all of her life, there's not been a budget in this country. That's sad. And we need to make sure that the Senate passes a budget. The House made tough decisions. All of us, we're freshmen. We came here, we've been here about a year. We came here willing to make tough decisions. We need the Senate to do the same thing. It starts with the first step, and that's passing a budget, any budget. Pass what they think is right. It might not be what we want, but let's have them pass a budget, then we can work out the differences. So I asked the Senate to please pass a budget. You know, we've got some time here. We'd like to see them do it sooner rather than later. With that, I'd like to introduce Alan Nunley from Mississippi. Alan.
Here I am.
Oop.
Thank you for being here. The President and the Senate Democrats are more interested in blaming Republicans than in working with us to find solutions. And the proof to that is in their actions. They've not even bothered to pass a budget in almost 1,000 days. And they're required to do that by law. Now, Mr. Reid, we expect the American people to abide by the laws, and the American people expect the United States Senate to abide by the law. It's a disgrace when they don't come up with a budget. Several years ago, when I lost my job due to a corporate merger, my wife and I sat down around the kitchen table. We made a pot of coffee. We got out a sheet of notebook paper, and on one side of the paper we wrote down what was our revenue. On the other side we wrote down this is how we're going to spend it. Americans are doing that at kitchen tables all around this country. That's a budget. Families are doing that, small businesses are doing that, and they have every reason to expect the United States Senate to follow their lead. Now, the President loves to lecture Republicans about how we need to work together for the good of the nation. I hope he will use the State of the Union to call on Harry Reid and the Democrats to pass a budget. Now we've got Bob Gibbs from Ohio to come next. All right. All right, come on, Tim. I meant to say Tim Griffin from Arkansas.
It didn't get this cold in Arkansas. Good grief. Thank y'all for giving me a second. You know, this is sort of a pretty fundamental point. If you want to know what my priorities are in my home, if you want to know what the House priorities are, you look at our budget. You look at my budget. When you put a budget together, you decide where you want to put your money. And those are your priorities. We have no earthly idea what the priorities of the Senate are because they don't have a budget. The last House didn't have a budget. We got into office last year and we got our budget done. And the budget that we put together showed that we want to deal with the country's debt and we want a pro-growth tax code. It's been almost 1,000 days and the Senate hasn't done one. So we have no idea what their priorities are, yet they run around attacking House Republicans for what the work we're trying to do, trying to get our fiscal house in order. We know why they're avoiding a budget, because they want to be able to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want to put down on paper what their priorities are. So I just want to reiterate what everybody else here is saying, which is you have a basic duty, folks over in the Senate, to put a budget together, put it before the American people so we can see what your priorities are, and then we can start working together. Thank you. Alan West.
Well, thanks for joining us on this beautiful South Florida sunny winter day. I just want to tell you that this past Sunday on Meet the Press, we saw Senator Harry Reid talk about people being obstructionists. We saw him blame the Tea Party. We saw him blame Senate Republicans. He's even blamed House freshmen on the Republican side. But what Harry Reid does not understand simply, the constitutional conservative grassroots movement called the Tea Party stands for this. They stand for fiscal responsibility. They stand for fiscal sanity. And the American people have to balance budgets in their homes. Our small business owners have to balance budgets to run their businesses. So obviously what Harry Reid calls obstructionism, I look at it, he stands for fiscal irresponsibility. He stands for fiscal insanity. And I would ask one simple question of each and every one of you that are standing behind the cameras, that are standing here with your pens and pads and your recording devices. When are you going to go over to Harry Reid and ask him what's up with that? The fact that we have gone 1,000 days. We came here as young freshmen and we got a budget passed. We're asking the Senate to own up to the one constitutional mandate that we have, is to pass a budget. So that everyone continues to talk about how terrible House Republicans are. Well, you need to share the message that we're doing the job that the American people sent us up here to do. But obviously Harry Reid does not believe in responsibility or fiscal sanity, and therefore we see the economic situation in which our country stands. Send Harry Reid a message. What's up with that? And I will be followed by my good colleague from Texas, Bill Flores.
Thank you, Alan. Well, good morning. What a coincidence that on the day the President talks about the State of the Union, it'll be the same day that we've gone 1,000 days without a Senate-passed budget. Now, the President's going to try to tell the American people that the economic State of the Union is strong, but Americans know better. We've had over 35 months of over 8% unemployment. We have massive uncertainty in the private sector. And a lot of that starts right here in Washington, D.C., because we've got overreaching regulations, we've got out-of-control deficits, and we've got a Senate that can't even pass the most basic of policy statements, and that's a federal budget. My granddaughter is not quite a year old yet. And what she's telling me, even though she doesn't say very much, is that, Mr. Reid, we can't wait. We can't wait for you to do your job. We can't wait for you to pass a budget that's responsible, that doesn't take the burden of your bad decisions today and put it on her shoulders. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Randy Holtgren from Illinois.
I'm from just outside of Chicago, and it's actually kind of a nice warm January day here today. But anyhow, it is good to be with you, and this is a really, really important thing that we're talking about today. 1,000 days of failure. 1,000 days of failure of a very basic responsibility that we have, and that is to budget. Budgeting is important because it's an accountability tool for the American people to see, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we following through on the commitments, or are we spending money we don't have? That is the reason why the Senate has failed to pass a budget, is they don't want to admit we are spending money we don't have. They don't want to be accountable to the American people. It's got to stop. It's got to change. We're here, all of us are here, really fighting for our families. I brought a picture of my family along today, my 4 kids, and just to remind me again that it's fighting for their future, the hope and opportunity that they deserve. That's why a budget is so important. That's why we need Harry Reid to act. That's why we need the Senate to act, to recognize 1,000 days is far too long. This has to change. It's got to stop. We need accountability out here. We need to get Washington living within its means again. With that, I turn it over to Scott Ridgell. Scott here? James Langford. Is James here?
Yep, that is. Thank you. Simple issue. We have a massive debt that we're all very aware of, $15.3 trillion in debt right now. There is a bigger problem, though, than $15.3 trillion in debt, and it is the fact that we have no plan to get out of it. We're on autopilot to continue to increase our spending. We have to have a plan to get out of this debt. So while $15.3 trillion is incredibly significant, 100% debt to GDP is incredibly significant, the bigger issue is There is no significant plan to get out of this. Last year when the president presented his budget to this group of freshmen here, we read through his budget anticipating there would be a plan to get out of it. It took us from $14 trillion in debt to $26 trillion in debt in the 10-year window that the president presented to us. We have to not only work on the existing debt, but we have to have an established, functioning plan, and the only way to do that is for the House and the Senate to work together through the traditional budget process and start getting on top of this. I am sorry that the president does not like working with the Senate and the House to try to get things accomplished, and that he is determined that he's going to be extra constitutional and say we can't wait and I'm just going to do this on my own and skip Congress. He seemed to work well with Congress when the House and the Senate were both Democrats. But now that there is another party to work with, he's decided he doesn't want to work with anyone on that point. The simple fact is the Senate has to do a budget. The president has to work with both parties to be able to come to some resolution, because we cannot continue to wait with no plan to get out of this very significant debt that we're facing as a nation. With that, I'd like to introduce Bill Johnson.
Thanks, folks, and it's good to be here with you today. If you don't remember anything else that I say here, I want you to hear this. Washington, D.C. is broke. And that brokenness is affecting people back in my district in extremely bad ways. All up and down the Ohio River, all I hear from businesses is that, why can't Washington get something done? The uncertainty that's resulting from the gridlock in Washington, D.C. is hurting our ability to hire, to expand, to grow our businesses. Now, the system of government that our founders put in place is a divided system of government. And the Congress is a co-equal branch of the government with the President of the United States. We have a responsibility to lead and to govern, but we're not doing that. You can't say that leadership is being exemplified when we go 1,000 days without a budget. It's irresponsible. I can tell you, as a former Air Force veteran, I know what happens to leaders when they don't perform. They don't stay in leadership positions very long. We've got some very, very tough decisions to make in this country to get us back on the right track and to protect future generations. And tough decisions require tough leadership. And that's what we need the Senate to do. Others are showing pictures of their kids and their grandkids. Well, I've got a picture of my youngest granddaughter here on my cell phone. She's a little over a year old. Now, she can't talk too much yet, but I'm pretty sure if she could, she would tell us that she's pretty ticked. Because we're in debt. She is over $40,000 in debt herself, and that's climbing every day that the Senate refuses to act. 20-some job bills, 27-plus jobs bills sitting in the Senate that Harry Reid could act on today that would begin to bring some certainty to America's job creators. Folks, we can do better than this. The Senate needs to come back to work. Harry needs to lead. America deserves better. With that, I want to yield to my good friend and colleague, Representative Todd Young.
Ladies and gentlemen, the American people deserve a budget. It is the first step to fixing Washington. It's where those of us who are serving our constituents lay out our priorities. We put it all on the line. We establish priorities. We indicate where we stand. We present our vision for America. Washington is clearly broken. It's something all of us hear from our constituents when we travel home. It's something we hear in our offices here in Washington. The question is, how are we going to fix it, and when are we going to fix it? Well, I really think the root of the problem is that too few people in Washington are getting specific. Once we get specific, laid out in a scorable, written plan, then that allows Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals to compare notes, and gosh darn it, maybe we'll even find some common ground. So Harry Reid needs to act. The president needs to encourage the Senate to get in line. It's time to fix Washington. Let's get started. Let's pass a budget that the American people will be proud of. Thank you. Next is Mark Amodei.
I'll go. Mark not here.
And a very colorful version of Mark Amaday is my other good friend, Billy Long. So thank you.
I didn't make the list, so I just thought I'd step up here. When we were sworn in last year, the first vote I took was for John Boehner for Speaker of the House. The second or third vote I took was for a continuing resolution. I said, why are we voting for a continuing resolution? Well, we need to keep the government open for 2 more weeks. Now, wait a minute, they didn't have a budget last year? You can ask yourself why we didn't have a budget last year, but why did the Democrats not have one the year before when they had the House, the Senate, and the White House? Why did they not have one the year before that? I think the answer is simple. It's all about getting reelected up here. That's all anybody cares about. When you put down a budget like we did last year and voted for our budget, it wasn't 2 days later we had a picture of Grandma getting thrown off the cliff in a wheelchair. And that's the reason that we don't have a budget, and that's the reason we're probably not going to have a budget all this year. So just to cut to the chase and let you know why they don't want to put anything in writing. When you put something in writing, then they know what your plan is, what your program is, so your opponents can attack you on it. This is a class made up of 2 auctioneers. Jeff Duncan behind me is also an auctioneer. We've got a pizza parlor owner, a termite exterminator. We've got doctors. We have nurses in this freshman class. We were sent to Washington, D.C. to do the right thing for the right reason every day we're here, not to get reelected. And that's what we worked on last year, and that's what we're going to work on this year. I'm not Mark Amaday, but I approve that message. Rick Crawford. Is Rick here? All right. Reed Ribble. There you go. It's Mark.
I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and in 1,000 days, it took less than 1,000 days to build Lambeau Field. 1,000 days is a very long time. At the end of the last year, we had to listen to Senator Reid berate House Republicans, especially freshman Republicans, because we didn't know how to govern. There's nothing more basic to government than managing the nation's and taxpayers' finance. I am not about to be lectured to by Harry Reid on government. He hasn't even been able to pass a budget in 1,000 days. Maybe next Tuesday when the president comes over here to talk to us, he should talk about the state of the U.S. Senate rather than the state of the Union. It's offensive what's going on there. And in part, the media is complicit in it. You ought to go over there and ask him why he hasn't done his job. You know, he talks about his boxing days. It's time for Harry Reid to man up, get in the ring, and pass a budget. Next up, Tim Hillskamp from Kansas.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that. I'd like to introduce you to my family. If any family, or business for that matter, has a debt problem, a financial advisor will tell them the first order of business is to pass a budget. 1,000 days since Senator Reid has passed a budget. The president's requested another $1 trillion in debt. Over $16 trillion by the time this president spends that money. And 1,000 days without a budget through the Senate. It's been 1,000 days. There have been 10 shuttle missions in those 1,000 days. In those 1,000 days, hundreds of people have climbed Mount Everest. It's more difficult to climb Mount Everest, Senator Reid, than to pass a budget through the Senate. In those 1,000 days, we've had the iPhone 3G. We've had the iPhone 4. We've had the iPad introduced. Still no budget through the U.S. Senate. Mr. President, Senator Reid, when we sit down for that State of the Union, the President will laud many achievements of the American people, and rightly so. But there will be no achievements to laud out of the U.S. Senate. No budget, no nothing. I look forward to your action, Mr. Reid. And next, I'll turn the podium over to the mayor, a gentleman who actually had to pass a budget numerous times. State of New Hampshire, Congressman Frank Ginta. Frank, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Tim said, I was a former mayor of New Hampshire, state's largest city, Manchester, and one of the things that we had to do by charter is pass a budget each and every year. Didn't always pass the budget that I would have liked to see, but we had to pass it, we had to administer it. It was the responsibility of those who were elected to govern. And I, like many freshmen, decided to run for Congress in hopes of changing how Washington operates, changing America for the better. And what I've seen in my first year representing New Hampshire is, quite honestly, the Senate making a joke out of governing. It's irresponsible not to have a budget. We're going to keep saying this to you until you be part of the solution. And go to Harry Reid's office and ask him point blank why he will not produce a budget. We would love to see that as House members. We're here to work on behalf of our constituents, on behalf of the country. We don't mind the questions that you bring to us when there are disagreements from the Senate about what we're doing. We're here to answer them. But we're asking you to ask those same questions of Senate leaders. And when Senate leaders block for 1,000 days the most basic and fundamental responsibility of our government, it becomes a mockery. And it's why people in this country are disappointed with those who govern. And we want to change that about our country. We love our country. We love the opportunity that we can afford our children and our grandchildren. But it's the responsibility of leaders not to act like children, but to act like adults. We're here to work. In the beginning session of this Congress, in our first term, we are here to work, and we will work with anybody who is willing to work with us. And we ask you to play that role and play that part as members of the media, to ask Harry Reid to join the House in getting a budget passed. And with that, I'll introduce my friend from South Carolina, the other auctioneer, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You know, there's an old adage that says that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But I'm here to tell you that the journey toward fiscal responsibility does not take 1,000 days. It takes action. It's time for Harry Reid to take that action. It's high noon. We're here to challenge him to do what's right for America. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend from New Mexico, Congressman Steve Pierce.
Thank you. I'm from New Mexico. Small business, small state, big problems. Every middle-class American family is facing losing their home. Countries are filing bankruptcy. Entire countries are failing. Iceland has collapsed financially. Ireland cannot pay its debt. Greece is insolvent. In the U.S. is exactly the same way. The common theme running through every country failure is that they have debt they cannot pay. The U.S. has debt it cannot pay. And the sound you hear coming from the other institution is the fiddling on this Titanic. The reason people are angry and frustrated is not because of the Tea Party. It is because of the Senate and its failure to act. They understand we in the House may not agree with them, but they understand that we have taken some step. The Senate blames Republicans while steadfastly refusing to pass one jobs bill, steadfastly refusing to pass the Keystone Pipeline, steadfastly refusing to pass a budget. Mr. Reid, you're in charge of the place. Make something happen. I would introduce Mr. Ken Sako. Yeah.
Thank you. We came here 1 year ago. I, one of 87 new freshmen, many of us coming from the private sector, many of us with real-world experiences of how to do business, how to run a budget, and how to run a financially sound operation. We came here as citizen legislators to change things in Washington. And we've worked very hard for 12 months in order to do just that. One of the first things we did was the most basic of all business principles, and that is to pass a budget. We did that happily in April of last year. And yet we have no budget for this country. We've been fighting hard against a shrill of political accusation only to gain political upper hand rather than to tend to the real business of America, which is the business and making sure that we have a budget, that we have sound financial principles running our nation. I urge the Senate and I urge Harry Reid to pass a budget 1,000 days is just pathetic. We have to have a budget. And with that, I yield to my friend from New York.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone, for being here. You can tell the people who are not from the Northeast, they've all got coats and gloves on. This is balmy by our standards. Thanks for being here this morning. We will take questions, and really, I'm so pleased to join my colleagues here this morning in telling Harry Reid to just do your job. That's all we're asking. Just do your job. Do what the American taxpayers are paying for. We fund a budget committee over in Harry Reid's office, and he's not doing his job. 1,000 days is it's inexcusable, it's reprehensible, and he needs to do his job and pass a budget. With that, I'm happy to answer some questions, and we'll take questions.
Can I ask Mr. Langford a question?
Sure.
You're on the budget committee.
Yes, sir.
And you understand that the budget produces a lot of promises and then a cap for the appropriations committee.
Right.
But you have a statutory cap, which is far stronger than anything the budget resolution does. So why isn't, I mean, what would Harry Reid passing a budget do that's any stronger than that?
Well, let me start with the basics of it. Since 1974 in the Budget Act there, it requires the House and the Senate to both pass it. So the law stands, we're supposed to both pass the budget, face reconciliation, that has been the traditional process. That's been rejected. So it's not just a simple, well, we'll just do appropriations bill, we'll just do CR bills. This establishes a principle of where we're trying to accomplish. The president does a budget, he's been on time with his. The House has passed a budget, the Senate refuses to do that. That is the working document. And to say that Republicans blocking the Senate is absurd. They have the committee structure, they can work this through their own committee. They haven't even brought it out of committee to be able to do it. So it's not a matter of not passing it, it's not even trying to be able to pass this and saying we're just going to skip the process that is established in law since 1974 and we're going to remake the process. If we need to do a new process, let's put it in law, but let's not just ignore the law in the books and say we're just not going to do it.
But, I mean, do you honestly think that the Republican House and the Harry Reid-led Senate could come together on a reconciliation bill? I mean, after all of the failures we've had in agreeing,
Well,
over the past year?
let's go back. 2 years ago, when Democrats had the House and the Senate didn't do a budget. 3 years ago, they weren't working on. You understand? This is not just current right now. This has happened for a while, even when Democrats ran both sides of this hill. And so this is a significant issue with the Senate that's been functioning for a while. That's frustrating for all of us to say, lay your principles out there. Let's work together. And again, it goes back to we have to be able to work together on these things. We have to do this. And the president's frustration of saying I'm not going to work with Congress anymore because there are some Republicans that are out there that are running part of it, that's not an excuse. We have to be able to work things together. And we're not even attempting that in the budget process. We need to get moving on it.
Can we safely assume that all of you are going to vote against the debt limit increase today?
We'll see what all comes in. Yeah.
I think so.
How do you imagine that one of the first things you're going to be faced with, especially when the Senate comes back, is extending the payroll tax cut? I just wonder how you imagine this situation that you're facing now will be different than the one you faced in December.
Well, on that, I'd be happy to talk about the payroll tax. The President of the United States asked the House and the Senate for a year extension. And consistently, House leaders stated that we were working on a year solution. We had a bipartisan vote in the House with a year solution. Most of the country didn't see that. What they saw was a 2-month extension from the Senate. We'd like to work together with the Senate. We work together with those Democrats in the House that believe in a functioning government. We continue to pass legislation, whether it's jobs related or the budget, pick any subject matter. We continue to pass legislation in the House and send it over to the Senate. Why do I believe that we'll get an extension passed? Because I still have the feeling of that there's probably some good people in this building who will think more about the country than their own election. I mean, that's why we're here. We're not thinking about our next election. We're thinking about what's right for the country. And if enough people in this Capitol believe that and start thinking that way, we'll get something accomplished on that extension. But if they don't start thinking that way, what exactly is going to happen to them is that they're no longer going to have a voice in this building because the country's fed up with it. We all hear it when we go back to our districts. The country's fed up. Republicans, Democrats, they want to see some action relative to progress of our responsibilities.
What do you expect Republican leadership to do differently this time?
I think Republican leadership is going to continue to reach out, propose legislation that can pass the House, hopefully bipartisanly. You know, we're doing it this next month on the Budget Committee with 10 different budget reform bills. We're inviting and joining Democrats to join in those solutions. And I think leadership's going to continue to fight for the principles that the country wants and expects out of Washington. So we hope that the majority of this year is not a campaign year, but it's a year about governing. That's what we're here to do. So we're here to govern. We'd like the other side to do their part and govern as well.
On the budget, we've heard a lot about, I heard some talk today about debt and deficits and all that, but since March of 2011, the Republican-controlled House has passed a series of continuing resolutions that added something like $1 billion to the national debt. I mean, if we're opposed to it, why continue to pass it? Why not amend it?
Well, I think that the bottom line is we need a plan to get the country out of this mess. And if you look across the country, all of the states have balanced budgets. Governors, whether they be Democrat or Republicans, present balanced budgets. State houses, state senates, whether they be controlled by Democrats or Republicans, or one party may control one, the other party controls the other, have all come together at the state level and done their jobs and balanced their budgets. And it's time for us to do the same thing. And the fact of the matter is, once we have a budget, then the questions you've asked will no longer be relevant because they'll be addressed in the budgets that the Senate and the House come to an agreement on. So I'll tell you, your question, I think, is one of my greatest frustrations, and certainly one of the greatest frustrations for the American public. But we're going to take one more question, and so who wants the last question? Then, ma'am.
The administration's going to formally announce later today that they're going to reject the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. I wanted to know your immediate reaction to that.
Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. And the bottom line is, the only way for us to break this country's dependency on the Mideast and oil from the Mideast is to bring things like the Keystone Pipeline in from Canada, to start drilling here in America. And I think the fact of the matter is, if the president rejects that, that just shows how absolutely out of touch he is with America and what it takes to get this economy back on track. Thank you for coming.